Welcome, wanderer of the night, to another journey through story and silence, where the world folds softly around memory and myth, and time itself begins to drift like mist over still water. So take a deep breath and let the sound of this tale carry you gently forward, because tonight we will walk through forests of chakra and history, through wars and whispers and dreams that once burned like lanterns in the dark. And as you listen, you might find that the story of Naruto is not simply the tale of a boy, but of every soul that has ever longed to be seen, every heart that has ever fought to be understood. So before you close your eyes, tell me in the quiet of your own mind, where in the world are you listening from, and what colors your dreams tonight? Let that answer drift on the wind, let it fall like leaves, and settle beside us as we begin. For the world we are about to enter is one that begins not with people or power, but with prayer. Long before there were hidden villages, before there were shinobi or chakra beasts, before even the word ninja had been spoken into being, there was only the earth, vast and still, dreaming beneath an endless sky, waiting to remember itself. Life moved slowly then, quietly, animals and spirits sharing the same rivers, the same winds, the same hunger. The gods were not distant in that time. They were the mountains, the thunder, the rain, the warmth of the sun, and the deep hum that slept beneath all living things. It was from that hum that chakra was born, though no one yet knew its name, for it existed first as feeling an invisible thread that connected every breath, every heartbeat, every leaf trembling in the wind, showing that separation was only an illusion the mind had made to protect itself from wonder. In that age of unknowing, humanity lived in small tribes, scattered and afraid, their days spent hunting and hiding, their nights spent whispering to the fires they built, asking the light to protect them from what they did not understand. And sometimes, when the fear grew too heavy, when their prayers rose together into the sky like smoke, something within the world would stir in answer, a pulse, a vibration, faint but certain, reminding them that they were never truly alone. Over centuries, this pulse grew stronger, drawn by their need, shaped by their longing, until at last it took form within a single being, the first to feel the flow of chakra within her own body, the first to bridge the distance between heaven and earth. Her name would one day be called Kaguya, and though she was born human, she would be remembered as something far beyond it. But before her, chakra existed only as potential, a song without a singer, a promise without a name. It was the earth's compassion and cruelty entwined, power offered not as gift but as reflection, making those who touched it see themselves clearly, too clearly, sometimes. To use chakra was to feel everything, the pain of others, the weight of all living memory, the ache of the world's endless becoming. It was not meant to be wielded, it was meant to be known. The first people who stumbled upon it did so by accident, through meditation, through loss, through the quiet despair of wanting something more than survival. And in that yearning, the invisible threads began to glow, weaving through them like light through water, awakening in their bodies the realization that they could shape the world not with tools, but with will. That realization changed everything. It was the beginning of magic, of battle, of hope, and of ruin. For once, humanity learned that thought could move the elements, that emotion could bend the shape of reality. They began to reach higher and further than ever before, building temples to their own awakening, carving symbols into stone, marking the boundaries of what they could control. The old gods grew silent then, not because they were gone, but because they were listening, waiting to see what their children would do with the gift they had drawn from the marrow of the world. And so chakra spread like wind, invisible but unstoppable, moving from one heart to another, crossing generations as easily as breath. It entered stories and songs, it changed the shape of dreams, and those who felt it began to see the world not as chaos, but as connection. The trees spoke through the air, the rivers sang in their sleep, the stars seemed to pulse in rhythm with the blood that now carried this strange light. For a time, there was harmony, a fragile peace built on curiosity rather than conquest. Villages began to gather where the chakra flowed strongest, sacred places that would one day become hidden villages, but then were simply sanctuaries of awe. People prayed not to be powerful, but to understand. Yet harmony, like all things, cannot last forever. The same light that reveals beauty also casts shadow, and where there is connection, there is also division. Those who could not feel the flow of chakra began to fear those who could, and fear, when it grows, always seeks control. Some used their gifts to heal, to guide, to bless the land. Others used them to dominate, to bend the will of others. The first wars were not fought with weapons, but with thought villages torn apart by differing beliefs about what chakra should be, who should wield it, and who should be denied. The gods watched in silence as the world fractured again, their gift becoming the seed of both enlightenment and destruction. And somewhere in the midst of that growing storm, beneath the shade of a sacred tree that touched both heaven and earth, a new kind of being awakened, one who would consume the fruit of that divine tree and carry within her the first true union of power and purpose. Her name, whispered by winds and remembered in fear, was Kaguya Otsutsuki, the one who would take chakra into herself and reshape the destiny of mankind forever. But before her rise, before her fall, before the wars that would follow her footsteps like shadows at dusk, there was still peace, a silence that hummed beneath everything, waiting to be broken. And so the world turned slowly toward its next breath. The fires burned low in the first villages. The children dreamed without knowing that their dreams were being woven into history, and the earth, vast and patient, whispered the same lullaby it had always sung, that all power begins as love, that all creation begins as longing, and that even in the smallest spark of a human heart, the universe hides entire worlds waiting to wake. Sleep softly now, for this was the beginning, the moment before the story remembered its name. The night before history began was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against the edges of the world and makes the stars seem closer, as if even they were holding their breath. And somewhere beneath that silence stood a single tree that was not a tree at all, its roots buried not in soil but in the bones of the earth itself, its branches reaching through clouds as though to stitch the sky back together. The people called it divine, the God tree, the source of all chakra, the axis upon which heaven and earth turned, though none yet understood its hunger. For the tree's stillness was not peace, but waiting, and what it waited for was devotion. Every few centuries it bloomed once, a single fruit glowing like a captured sun, and those who saw it felt both awe and dread, because they knew that the fruit was not a gift, but a test, the world's way of asking whether humanity could resist the temptation to become gods. And then she came, Kaguya Otsutsuki, a woman from beyond the stars, whose eyes carried the reflection of worlds already conquered, whose heart still remembered gentler places. She arrived not as conqueror but as exile, fleeing the endless wars of her own people, seeking in this new world the purity they had lost. The people who found her in the forests of the land of ancestors saw her as both miracle and omen, for she glowed faintly in the moonlight, her hair white as clouds, her movements soundless, her presence both human and something more. She watched them fight, watched them burn their own fields in the name of pride, watched them pray to the tree as though it were salvation. And perhaps it was pity, or perhaps it was longing, that led her to reach out and touch the tree's bark, her hand resting against its pulse like one might touch the chest of a sleeping giant. When she ate the fruit that hung there, the world exhaled. The fruit's power entered her as light enters water, diffusing, refracting, changing everything it touched. She felt the earth's breath, the sky's heartbeat, the slow dance of stars and oceans, and in that instant she was no longer merely human. She was the bridge between what was and what could be. She could feel the thoughts of every creature, the pain of every wound, the birth of every leaf, and it overwhelmed her until she understood that divinity is not strength, but burden. Still, with that power came the ability to bring peace, and for a time she did. She silenced the wars, she ended the bloodshed, she bent rivers and mountains to protect those who had once cowered beneath thunder. People began to call her the rabbit goddess, the protector, the mother of the world. They bowed when she passed, they whispered her name like prayer, and slowly she began to believe she could save them. But peace built on fear is only silence in disguise. The people who had once worshipped her began to whisper behind her back, frightened of her eyes, which saw too much, frightened of her voice, which could command the wind. Some believed her power a blessing, others a curse, and so she withdrew from them, retreating to the tree that had given her life, speaking to it in solitude, asking it why peace must always breed suspicion. The tree did not answer, but deep within its roots, something began to stir a consciousness ancient and vast, the echo of all that it had consumed before. That presence, later known as the Ten Tails, watched Kaguya with the patience of mountains, knowing that even gods can be lonely. It was in that loneliness that her children were born, Hagoromo and Hamura, twins carrying the same light that glowed within her veins, their cries echoing through the valleys like thunder and promise. Kaguya looked upon them and felt something new, something no divine power could give, the fragile, terrifying warmth of love. For a while, that love was enough to keep her grounded, to remind her that power meant nothing without connection. Yet even as she held them, she began to feel the whispers of the tree in her dreams, the slow pull of its will, reminding her that she was not its master but its vessel. The 10 Tails wanted what she had taken. It wanted its chakra back, and it began to reach for it through her, twisting her thoughts like roots through soil. The peace she had built began to crack. Villages that had once praised her now rebelled, afraid of her growing power, of the storms that followed her moods, of the way her eyes no longer seemed to belong to the world. In desperation, she turned her children against the people, declaring that humanity could not be trusted with its own freedom. She cast her will across the land, binding minds together, creating unity by force. Believing that obedience was a form of harmony, the people called it madness, she called it love. The more they resisted, the tighter she held them, until one night, beneath a moon she had herself created to watch over them, the whispers inside her became a roar, and the god tree's roots broke through the ground, merging with her body, consuming her until she became the very thing she had once defied, the 10 Tails itself. The world shuddered, mountains fell, oceans rose, and for the first time, the earth wept. The creature that had once been Kaguya became the embodiment of power. Without compassion, its chakra spreading through the land like fire, giving birth to beasts and monsters that echoed fragments of its will. Her sons, Hagoromo and Hamura, still children yet burdened with the wisdom of gods, saw what she had become and wept, for they knew they would have to stop her, not out of hate, but mercy. They fought for days that felt like years, light against shadow, love against fear, until finally they sealed her within the moon she had created, binding her body and dividing her chakra so that no single being could ever again wield all of it at once. And so the age of gods ended, and the age of men began, though the world would never forget her. The god tree's stump became legend, its roots sleeping beneath the soil, its fruit scattered through time, waiting for hands that would once again dare to reach for them. From Kaguya's body and grief were born the tailed beasts, 9 fragments of divine power that would wander the earth, each carrying a piece of her sorrow and her love, destined to shape the fates of countless generations. Above them, the moon shone pale and eternal, the silent prison of the first mother, who even now still dreamed of peace, dreaming that her children would one day forgive her, dreaming that the power she had misunderstood might one day be used as it was meant to be, not to rule, but to connect. And beneath that cold light, the world turned again, slower now, gentler, waiting for the next awakening, when humanity would rediscover the light she had both gifted and cursed them with chakra, the breath of life, the echo of the divine. Sleep softly, for this was the story of the beginning and the first mistake, the moment love became fear and power learned how to dream. The world was quiet after the battle that sealed the mother of all chakra away, quiet in a way that felt almost afraid of sound, as though the wind itself dared not disturb the ashes of what had once been divine. And beneath that, uneasy stillness, 2 brothers stood among the ruins of a paradise undone, the sons of Kaguya, the heirs to both her love and her sin, Hagoromo and Hamura, born of human heart and godlike power, watched the moon above them, glowing faintly with the light of their imprisoned mother, and they understood even then that victory did not mean peace, that some wounds do not bleed yet never close. The earth beneath them trembled as if remembering her rage, and the rivers that had once sung her name now ran silent, their waters heavy with memory. Hagoromo, who would one day be known as the Sage of 6 Paths, carried in his eyes the calm of understanding, while Hamura carried the stern weight of faith, and together they began the long work of healing what she had broken. The tailed beasts, born from the fragments of the 10 tails chakra, roamed the land like lost children, immense and terrible, their cries shaking the heavens. Each creature bore within it a piece of Kaguya's will, the longing to connect, the fear of being alone, and Hagoromo, feeling their sorrow, could not bring himself to destroy them. Instead, he spoke to them as one might, to frightened souls, telling them that they were not monsters but living reminders of balance, promising that, though they were made of power, they were still part of the world's heart. With his staff he divided the 10 tails chakra into 9, naming them with care, giving each a shape and a story, and in that act of naming he gave them identity. For the first time since their birth, the beasts were seen, and they slept in peace for a while. Hamura, guided by dreams, looked to the sky instead of the earth. He felt his mother's spirit still thrumming within the moon, her presence restless, her remorse echoing like a heartbeat in the silence of the stars. So he chose to ascend, leading a group of followers who would watch over her prison, guardians of a goddess and of the balance that she had once threatened. His path led him away from humanity into legend, into the lunar solitude where he would remain for centuries, his descendants one day becoming the beings known as the Otsutsuki once more, returning to the cycle they had tried to escape. Hagoromo stayed behind, choosing the world, choosing people, choosing the messy, fragile miracle of life. His brother's departure was their first farewell, the division of heaven and earth made flesh. Hagoromo wandered the continents for decades, barefoot, wrapped in the cloak of a monk, teaching those he met how to use the chakra that still flowed faintly through the air, not as weapon but as prayer. He taught that chakra was the thread that tied all living things together, that it was the pulse of the world speaking through them. To mold chakra, he said, was to remember that you were never alone. Some listened, some laughed, some tried and failed, but slowly the understanding spread, and humanity began to shape its energy into form, learning how to heal, to build, to defend, and, inevitably, to destroy. The sage's teachings became the first ninshu, the art not of fighting but of connection, and his disciples carried that philosophy to every corner of the known world. Where he walked, fields grew, rivers cleared, storms calmed, yet in every generation there were those who misunderstood, who mistook unity for control, compassion for power. When he grew older, Hagoromo settled among his followers, his body weathered by years but his spirit brighter than ever. It was there that he fell in love, not with power or divinity, but with a mortal woman whose laughter reminded him of sunlight on water. Together they had 2 sons, and though he loved them both, he could see from the moment they opened their eyes that they carried the eternal duality that had haunted the world since the beginning. Indra, the elder, inherited his father's brilliance and his mother's calm. Asura, the younger, inherited his father's heart and his mother's warmth. Indra could move mountains with a thought, could see the threads of chakra like rivers in the air, while Asura struggled for years to shape even the smallest flame. Yet his laughter drew people to him, his compassion healing wounds no jutsu could touch. Hagoromo saw in them the reflection of himself and his brother, of light and faith, of intellect and intuition, and he hoped that together they might maintain what he had built. But the old pattern was already stirring again. For balance does not mean stillness, it means motion, and motion means conflict. Indra grew restless with his father's teachings, impatient with humanity's weakness, convinced that connection was meaningless without control. He saw people lie, betray, destroy, and he concluded that only order could protect them from themselves. Asura, watching him, felt sorrow but also understanding, for he saw the pain that drove his brother's pride, the loneliness of one who always stands apart. The sage loved them both, and when his life began to fade, he gathered his disciples and told them that the world's future would depend not on strength, but on love, not on mastery of chakra, but on the willingness to share it freely. When he named Asura as his successor, choosing heart over intellect, the world trembled once more. Indra, unable to accept it, turned his love for his father into bitterness, his envy into purpose. He left in silence, his footsteps the beginning of an echo that would roll through centuries. The sage, dying, felt the shift in the air and wept softly, not for himself, but for the world he knew would now repeat his mother's mistakes, in new forms, the endless cycle of love becoming fear, of understanding becoming control. And as he closed his eyes for the last time, he sent a whisper into the wind, a hope wrapped in prayer, that one day the 2 halves of humanity, reason and compassion, pride and kindness, might walk together again without war. The stars above him flared briefly, the earth beneath him sighed, and in that sigh a new age began, the age of men, the age of shinobi, the age of inherited dreams and inherited pain. His sons would carry his legacy forward in ways he could neither prevent nor predict, their quarrel becoming myth, their descendants shaping the fate of the world again and again, until even the gods themselves would forget how it started. Yet somewhere, in the quiet between breaths, the old man's wish remained, floating through time like a dandelion seed, waiting for another boy, another era, another chance to bloom. Sleep gently now, for this was the story of the first teacher, the first brothers, and the first sorrow that even gods long for understanding, and that love, no matter how divine, must always learn to let go. The world was young again, or it seemed so, because when one generation fades, the next always believes it is the first, and Indra and Asura stood upon the same soil their father had sanctified, breathing the same wind that had once carried his prayers. Yet already their hearts were turning in different directions. Already the invisible river that runs through blood and history was beginning to divide into two streams. They had grown together, trained together, fought side by side as children against the storms that swept their father's land, and for a long time they were each other's mirror, Indra's brilliance balanced by Asura's laughter, Asura's patience sharpened by Indra's drive, each finding in the other the part of themselves they lacked. But love between brothers is fragile when the world begins to whisper comparisons, and the world whispered endlessly about them. How one boy could weave chakra into reality itself, while the other struggled even to light a lamp. How one's eyes seemed to see the pattern of the universe, while the others saw only people and their clumsy needs. Admiration twisted slowly into expectation, and expectation into jealousy, and beneath all of it, the seeds of their father's teachings began to grow crooked in the shadow of pride. Indra's mind was quick and merciless. He saw patterns in everything, weather, breath, emotion, and he believed that understanding those patterns meant mastering them. To him, Ninshu was not connection. It was control, the art of shaping the world into harmony through discipline and order. When he walked among the villages, he saw how easily people lied, how often they betrayed each other, and in his heart the light of reason hardened into judgment. He began to believe that compassion was weakness, that only through rule could chaos be stilled, that love without law was just another form of cruelty. His chakra, which once flowed like water, became like fire, brilliant, consuming, pure, the first to see the shape of his father's power reflected in himself. He awakened eyes unlike any before him, the Sharingan, mirrors of thought and memory, windows that showed him every movement before it happened. With that gift came distance, for one cannot see the world as lines and shadows and still feel it as heartbeat and warmth. Asura's world was smaller but deeper. He watched his brother create wonders and felt no envy, only confusion at why Indra's joy dimmed the brighter his power became. Asura learned through failure, through scraped hands and broken promises, through the gentle repetition of trying again. When he gathered followers, they came not because they feared him, but because they trusted him, because his clumsy honesty made them believe that even the weak could change the world if they stood together. He taught them that chakra meant sharing, that power was meant to be multiplied through compassion, not divided through control. When he finally mastered his own strength, it came not as a sudden awakening but as a soft dawning, a warmth that filled him from within, the realization that his father's teaching had never been about skill, but about heart. Their father watched them both with love and sorrow. He had wanted them to balance each other, to weave wisdom and kindness into one fabric, but as years passed, the distance grew until it became silence. When Hagoromo named Asura as his successor, Indra's smile vanished. He bowed, he walked away, and something in the air changed forever. That night, the fire around the camp dimmed. The stars felt cold, and Asura dreamed of a river splitting, carrying two reflections that could no longer find each other's eyes. Indra left not as a sun, but as a storm. His followers went with him, drawn by his strength, by the clarity of his vision. He told them that peace could not be achieved through understanding because understanding required too much faith, and faith could be betrayed. He built his own order, his own laws, his own idea of harmony enforced by fear. And when his father's spirit passed into the world beyond, when the old sage's body returned to dust, Indra's anger at his brother turned from hurt into destiny. He believed that he alone carried the truth of their father's gift, that Asura had stolen something sacred, and he swore that if the world could not be shaped by love, he would shape it by will. The battle between them was not one of armies at first, but of ideologies, of stories whispered to their followers, of prayers that became curses. Asura fought not to destroy his brother, but to save him, while Indra fought to prove that love was a lie. When they finally met beneath the same moon their grandmother had created, the air trembled with power that felt older than time, the light of the Sharingan blazing against the warmth of Asura's chakra. They fought until the earth split, until rivers boiled, until lightning itself seemed to scream, and when at last Indra fell, his eyes dimming, his last words were not of hate but of confusion. Why had love betrayed him again? Asura buried him beneath a tree and wept. He thought the cycle ended there, but cycles never end, they only sleep. Indra's spirit, too proud to vanish, lingered like smoke, and Asura's heart, too full to rest, waited for him. Generation after generation, their souls would return to the world, reborn again and again, always drawn to one another, always repeating the same question their father had left unanswered. Can peace be born from power or only from love? Centuries would pass, villages would rise and fall, names would change, but the pattern would remain: Indra and Asura, intellect and heart, control and compassion chasing and colliding through time like twin comets, bound to the same orbit. And one day, when the world was older and the stories of gods had become myths told to children around fires, their descendants would meet again, carrying the same blood, the same curse, the same longing to break free. Their names would be Uchiha and Senju, and through them, the old river would begin to flow once more toward destiny. Sleep gently now, for this was the story of the first brothers to love and to fight, the story of how even divinity cannot escape the ache of family, and the truth that every generation is just another retelling of the same dream to be understood, to be forgiven, to find, at last, a peace that does not require victory. The world changed shape around their legend, centuries folding and unfolding like paper, the names of gods fading into stories, the stories becoming folklore, and still, through the quiet rhythm of time, the echo of those two brothers endured. It drifted in bloodlines and dreams, in whispers carried by the wind, shaping entire nations without ever showing its face. The sons of Indra, proud and fierce, became known as the Uchiha. The sons of Asura, steadfast and kind, became known as the Senju. They built their homes far apart, yet their destinies drew them together again and again, like magnets made from memory, and each meeting ended the same way, with ideals clashing, blades crossing, and the earth beneath them, scarred by the weight of their ancestors' unfinished quarrel. The Uchiha clan learned to wield chakra with precision that bordered on poetry, their Sharingan eyes spinning like red mirrors that reflected both the beauty and cruelty of the world. They saw too much and felt too deeply, and so they lived with an intensity that frightened even themselves. Their strength came from emotion, from the same love that once bound Indra to his family, but when that love broke, it turned into fire, the kind that consumes everything it touches. The Senju, in contrast, built their strength from unity, from bonds woven through laughter and loyalty, from the belief that power meant nothing without trust. They gathered other tribes beneath their banner, uniting scattered families under one name, creating not dominance, but cooperation. Where the Uchiha saw the world as a storm to master, the Senju saw it as a garden to nurture, and though both visions were born from love, love, as always, was never enough to bridge the distance between fear and understanding. The wars that followed were endless, each one more senseless than the last. Fields soaked with the dreams of those too young to remember what the fighting was for. Children were taught to hate before they learned to write, and the sky seemed always heavy with the smell of smoke. In this chaos, 2 boys were born, one to each clan, and though neither knew it, their meeting would decide the rhythm of the world for generations. Hashirama of the Senju and Madara of the Uchiha, 2 names that would echo like thunder in the centuries to come, 2 hearts that carried both the curse and the promise of their ancestors. They met not as warriors but as children, by a river that divided their territories, each unaware at first of who the other truly was. They skipped stones, they spoke of dreams, they laughed in the way only children can, as though laughter itself could protect them. Hashirama dreamed of a world without war, a world where children could grow old before they learned to kill. Madara, even then, dreamed of strength, not for glory, but for safety, for the fragile peace he could never find in a world that kept taking from him. They built their friendship on hope, but hope, in that age, was fragile as glass. When they discovered each other's lineage, their clans pulled them apart, calling them traitors for even daring to speak. Yet neither could forget the other. They grew into men on opposite sides of the same war, each fighting for a peace that could never coexist with the others. Years passed, and battle after battle burned away their innocence until only conviction remained. Hashirama rose as leader of the Senju, Madara as the pride of the Uchiha, and for a brief moment it seemed the cycle would repeat exactly as before until exhaustion overcame pride. When the 2 met again upon the battlefield, surrounded by death, they looked at one another and saw not enemies, but 2 boys by a river, 2 souls still dreaming of peace. Hashirama offered a hand. Madara, weary, took it. The war ended not with conquest, but with compromise, and together they built something the world had never known, a village where the clans could live side by side, protected not by fear, but by shared purpose. They named it Konohagakure, the hidden village in the leaves, and it was there that the era of the shinobi truly began. For a time, peace bloomed. Children played without knowing the sound of war. Families built homes instead of graves, and the dream of unity felt real. Hashirama became the first Hokage, a title meaning fire's shadow, one who protects from behind the light, and he believed that love could guide the future. But shadows, once cast, always stretch. Madara began to see cracks in the peace they had made, the mistrust in the eyes of other clans, the subtle fear that lingered whenever his name was spoken. The Uchiha, he realized, would never truly be trusted, not while their power could turn emotion into weapon, not while their eyes still glowed red in the dark. Hashirama's peace, however noble, was still built upon balance, through control, and control, to Madara, was just another word for cage. He left the village quietly, at first, disappearing into the forests that bore its name. When he returned, it was with new power, the eternal Mangekyo Sharingan, eyes that had seen too much of love and death, and with them, a vision of the world beyond the horizon. He spoke of a plan to end the cycle forever, to create a world without conflict by binding all hearts together through illusion, through a dream that would erase suffering at its root. Hashirama listened, heartbreaking, because he understood and disagreed at once. They fought beneath the valley of the end, the roar of the waterfall between them like the heartbeat of the world itself. When it was over, Madara fell, and the dream of their shared peace fell with him. The river where they had once skipped stones now ran red, and their statues would one day stand there, facing each other for eternity, reminders that even love, when shadowed by power, can become a curse. The cycle had turned again. Indra and Asura reborn, still searching for the answer their father could never give, still teaching the world that peace without understanding is only the silence before another storm. So sleep softly now as the wind moves through the leaves of that hidden village, whispering the same lullaby it has always sung, that love and pain are twins, that friendship and loss share the same roots, and that every end, no matter how tragic, is only the beginning of another story waiting to bloom. The dream of a village spread like fire in tall grass, carried by word and wonder across the lands, and those who had once known only endless battle began to imagine that there might be another way to live, that perhaps walls could protect more than territory, that perhaps a symbol could hold more meaning than bloodlines. From the quiet hope that had been born between Hashirama and Madara, other leaders drew their own designs, and in time the nations of the world began to take shape around the idea of hidden villages, each one a mirror of the others, each one built upon the bones of old rivalries. In the land of earth rose Iwagakure, where the stones themselves seemed to remember every war that had ever scarred them. In the land of water, Kirigakure's mist swallowed secrets before they could be spoken. In the land of wind, Sunagakure shimmered like a mirage, built upon dunes that shifted as easily as alliances. And in the land of lightning, Kumogakure crowned its mountains with thunder, its people teaching their children that strength was the only sky worth worshipping. Together they formed the 5 great shinobi nations, 5 fragments of one dream, all pretending for a moment that they could forget the past. Konoha, the first and the heart of them all, grew beneath the canopy of endless trees. The laughter of its children became its anthem, the flutter of its banners, its heartbeat. Hashirama walked its streets with pride and humility both, seeing in every smiling face a promise that the world could indeed be better than what he and Madara had inherited. His brother Tobirama, pragmatic where Hashirama was idealistic, watched more carefully, his eyes always measuring, his hands already building the systems that would keep the village from collapsing under its own dream. He created the institutions that would one day define the shinobi world, the academy, the police force, the exams, the structure that turned war into work, chaos into duty. He believed that order was the only way to preserve Hashirama's peace, and though his intentions were noble, the seeds of division took root again in the soil of his caution. The Uchiha, powerful and proud, were given guardianship over the village's security, but in truth, it was a gilded cage. Their eyes, once symbols of hope, became reminders of fear, their passion reinterpreted as danger. The Senju's compassion became law, the Uchiha's love became suspicion, and between the two the fragile balance of peace began to tilt. Still, for a time, it held. Children grew into shinobi without ever seeing true war, missions replaced battles, and the world entered an age of uneasy prosperity. The shinobi became tools of their villages, their loyalty branded into their identities, their emotions sharpened into weapons. The will of fire, Hashirama's teaching that love was the source of strength, burned bright, but even a fire needs fuel, and fuel is always consumed. Tobirama, after Hashirama's death, became the second Hokage. He ruled with clarity and purpose, understanding that dreams alone cannot keep a nation alive. He trained the next generation, Sarutobi Hiruzen, the boy with eyes full of curiosity and heart full of empathy, who listened more than he spoke, who would one day carry both the Senju's wisdom and their burden. Tobirama's reign was shorter than his brother's, ended by duty and sacrifice in battle, but his influence lingered long after his name was carved into stone. He left behind not just a village, but a blueprint for power, one that could preserve peace through structure, through secrecy, through strength disguised as compassion. The balance held, but beneath it, resentment brewed. The Uchiha watched from the shadows of their own village, their pride turning quietly into pain, their love once again twisted into distance. Other nations watched Konoha and followed its model. The 5 Kage titles, echoing the Hokage's shadow, met in uneasy councils, sharing words that hid weapons, peace treaties that read like confessions of exhaustion. Children grew up believing in symbols more than truth. The leaf, the stone, the cloud, the mist, the sand. Each village whispered that theirs was the true path to honor. Yet when famine came, or borders blurred, or a leader died, the cycle reignited. Alliances fractured, old hatreds rekindled, and the same fields that had been sown with hope burned again. The first great ninja war began, not with a declaration, but with a misunderstanding magnified by fear. Shinobi fought for nations that barely remembered their names. Techniques that had once been prayers became instruments of horror sealing jutsu, forbidden arts, experiments that stretched the limits of life itself. The very chakra that had once connected all beings became the currency of death. Hashirama's dream cracked, Tobirama's structure hardened into bureaucracy, and the young Hiruzen, inheriting a village already trembling from the strain, found himself at the center of a world where peace was always only a pause between funerals. Yet even then, amid the ruins of fields and families, he believed because he had to, because if he did not, then the meaning of all those sacrifices would dissolve like ash. In Konoha, the trees still grew, their roots deep, their branches intertwined, sheltering those who had survived. The will of fire was spoken like a lullaby to children at bedtime, a promise that the previous generation would always protect the next, that every death meant another could live without fear. It was a beautiful lie, and a necessary one. The hidden villages had become not havens, but cages painted with hope, yet for those born within them, the illusion was enough. They trained, they loved, they grieved, and they carried their village's symbol upon their foreheads, as both blessing and curse. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of treaties or traditions, the descendants of the Sage of Six Paths watched from shadows and bloodlines, waiting for the wheel to turn again. The gods were silent now, but their echoes remained in every act of kindness, in every war fought for love, in every child born into the dream of peace. The villages would endure, because humanity endures, and so would the sorrow that binds it. Sleep softly now, for this is how the world built its walls of leaves and stone, believing that structure could save what only compassion ever could. The dream of peace lives on, fragile as glass, bright as fire, waiting for another generation to test its warmth and risk being burned. The years that followed the founding of the hidden villages felt like the slow breathing of a world that had almost forgotten what quiet sounded like. The smoke of war faded into the mist that hung above Konoha's rooftops, and for a while, The village lived as though peace was a natural thing, not a fragile thread stretched between the hands of those too tired to fight anymore. Beneath the wide boughs of the great trees, children ran with wooden kunai, laughing, imagining themselves as heroes, whose stories would outlast the evening light. The smell of rain on earth mixed with the faint hum of chakra that pulsed through the air, as if the world itself was exhaling after centuries of strain. And at the center of it all, the Hokage's stone faces watched from the mountain, Hashirama's kindness, Tobirama's resolve, two ghosts carved into permanence to remind everyone that even peace must be guarded. But history does not sleep for long. Peace, in the shinobi world, is a pause before inheritance. When the old wounds begin to fade, new ones are always waiting beneath them, impatient to be named. The first great ninja war had ended with uneasy truces and exhausted armies, but the hatred it had sown did not vanish. It simply changed shape, hiding in the hearts of orphans, in the policies of leaders who believed that survival demanded secrecy, in the laboratories of men who confused curiosity for cruelty. Out of that silence came new generations who had never seen the fields burn but could still smell the smoke in their parents' voices. Among them was a boy named Hiruzen Sarutobi, who had been raised under Tobirama's watchful eye, taught that leadership meant bearing the weight of both love and guilt in equal measure. He was brilliant but kind, the kind of mind that could see the pattern of a jutsu and the pain behind it at once. When Tobirama fell in battle, leaving behind more questions than answers, Hiruzen became the third Hokage, still young, still hopeful, carrying in him the echo of his teacher's discipline and his first mentor's compassion. Under his rule, Konoha entered an age of rebuilding, a time when the scars of war were patched over with policy and festivals, when children once again dreamed of becoming shinobi not to avenge, but to protect. Yet every generation inherits not only dreams but their shadows. Hiruzen's students were three children who reflected the contradictions of the world he had built. Jiraiya, whose laughter hid a yearning for meaning that no book or battle could satisfy. Tsunade, fierce and bright, carrying both the gift of healing and the curse of loss. Orochimaru, the genius who looked at mortality and saw insult instead of truth, who loved knowledge so much he forgot that wisdom requires restraint. Together they were called the legendary Sannin, the three who would one day carry Konoha's legend beyond its borders, though each in their own way would also carry its burden. The world beyond Konoha's walls, however, had not changed as much as the festival suggested. While the will of fire burned bright within the village, outside it the embers of resentment glowed quietly. New weapons were forged, new alliances drawn in sand instead of ink. The second and third great ninja wars began as whispers, border skirmishes, retaliations, pride dressed as diplomacy, and then grew into the same storms that had swallowed generations before. Villages that once called themselves allies turned their young into soldiers again, and the dream of peace once more became a story parents told their children to help them sleep. Through it all, Hiruzen remained, his face lined by time and sorrow, his eyes still searching for a balance that did not exist. He saw what Tobirama had warned him about, how fear turns even the righteous into tyrants, how power, when hoarded for safety, breeds rebellion in the hearts of those who must obey. He watched the Uchiha sink deeper into isolation, their patrols near the village's edge, feeling more like exile than duty, and though he wished to change it, he did not know how to untangle what had already been woven into the village's foundations. Konoha's peace depended on the quiet control of its strongest clan, and that control depended on trust that no longer existed. Meanwhile, the wars carved other stories. Jiraiya wandered the world, learning its sorrows, carrying orphan children on his back through burning villages, writing notes about destiny in a worn notebook he never showed anyone. Tsunade buried too many she loved, her hands trembling with power she could no longer bear to use. Orochimaru, staring into the mirror of mortality, decided that if life must end, then humanity itself was flawed, and he set out to fix it, one forbidden experiment at a time. The Sannin, once students of hope, became monuments to the truths their teacher had always feared, that love makes one vulnerable, that compassion breaks before it bends, and that even the brightest hearts can be swallowed by the dark if they stare at it long enough. By the time the third great ninja war came, the shinobi world had grown accustomed to grief. Villages sent children to fight because there were no adults left to spare. Entire generations were born knowing only duty and loss. Yet even in that darkness, the will of fire did not die. It burned quietly in small acts of courage, in Kakashi's discipline, in Obito's reckless kindness, in Rin's compassion that shone even when surrounded by death. It flickered in Minato Namikaze's speed and gentleness, in the way he carried both the strength to fight and the tenderness to forgive. Every light that rose from the ashes of war carried within it the same dream, that maybe this time, the next generation would not have to repeat what came before. When the fighting finally stopped, Konoha stood once more scarred, smaller, but still alive. The third Hokage walked its streets as an old man, watching the children run past him, their laughter ringing like distant bells, and he thought of his teachers, his students, and the faces that had come and gone. He thought of the words Hashirama had once spoken about love, and he wondered if perhaps the only way to protect the village was to keep dreaming, even when the dream kept breaking. The world around him turned, the seasons changed, and the tree leaves fell as they always did, whispering their same refrain, everything ends and everything begins again. So close your eyes now and imagine the wind moving gently through those leaves, carrying the memory of every life that has ever called the village home. Imagine the warmth of the lanterns at dusk, the laughter that refuses to die, the fire that still burns quietly at the center of all things. The story continues, as it always does, in the hands of the next generation, who will inherit both the dream and the weight of keeping it alive. The third great ninja war faded like a fever, leaving the world in the soft, aching quiet that follows too much pain, a silence full of ghosts and half-healed promises. Villages buried their dead, rebuilt their walls, and counted their living, not in numbers, but in silences, empty seats at the table, names carved into stone. In Konoha, the air smelled of damp earth and renewal, the streets alive again with children who did not yet understand what their laughter cost. Hiruzen Sarutobi, older now, slower, watched them from the Hokage's tower and thought of all the times he had promised himself that this war would be the last. The will of fire still glowed inside him, but like embers at dusk, steady, beautiful, and tired. Among those new children was a generation unlike any before it, born in the long shadow of loss, but carrying within them the stubborn light of hope. There was Minato Namikaze, quiet and brilliant, moving with the calm of a man who could see possibilities where others saw endings. There was Kushina Uzumaki, fierce and alive, her laughter as sharp as her anger, and beyond them, others who would one day shape the future of the shinobi world without ever intending to. Their youth was marked by the same rhythm as all who came before them, the soft mornings of training, the long evenings of learning what it meant to protect something larger than themselves. And though they were taught to fight, they were also taught to believe that the dream their elders had built could still survive. Minato rose quickly, his brilliance undeniable, his humility disarming even to his rivals. They called him the Yellow Flash, a name that moved faster than fear itself, and for a brief, shining moment, he became the symbol of what the shinobi could be: strong without cruelty, clever without arrogance, hopeful without illusion. When the village looked at him, they saw the dream of peace reborn, not in the solemn eyes of an elder, but in the gentle smile of youth. And when he became the fourth Hokage, the people cheered not just for their protector, but for the idea that maybe this time the world would stay kind. But destiny, in the shinobi world, has always had a cruel sense of humor. In the same breath that brings peace, it plants the seed of the next disaster. Beyond the walls of the Leaf, the great nations still watched each other warily, rebuilding armies under the pretense of reconstruction. Within Konoha itself, the Uchiha's isolation had deepened into resentment, their pride worn thin by suspicion, their hearts heavy with memories of all they had lost. And far beyond, in the dark corners of forgotten lands, old bloodlines stirred again, the Otsutsuki's legacy whispering through generations, the echo of Kaguya's hunger, finding new shapes. Minato and Kushina's love, simple and bright, was a brief sanctuary in that growing unease. They met as shinobi, fell in love as equals, and built their bond not on duty, but on laughter and defiance. When their son was born, on a night when the stars seemed too close to the earth, they named him Naruto, after the swirl of wind and waves, a name that meant motion and hope. He cried with the strength of someone who already carried generations in his lungs, and his mother laughed through tears, promising him a life free of the curses that had haunted her clan. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the will of fire burning brighter than ever before. But fate, fickle, patient, unrelenting, was already waiting. The nine-tailed fox, Kurama, a being of immense chakra and ancient sorrow, had slept long beneath the seal that bound him inside Kushina, until that night, when chains of illusion and betrayal broke his rest. The masked man who unleashed him moved like a ghost and spoke like someone who had once believed in the same dream he now sought to destroy. His eyes, red and spinning, carried the same pattern that had cursed generations, the legacy of Indra reborn. In the chaos that followed, Konoha burned again, the sky split by fire, the streets awash in fear, and the great fox roared its grief into the night. Minato fought as no man had fought before, swift as lightning, steady as dawn, and in the end, he did what every Hokage must. He sacrificed himself for those who would inherit the world after him. With a seal and a prayer, he split the nine tails in two, sealing one half within his own soul and the other within his newborn son, entrusting to a child the burden and the hope of all humanity. Kushina, her strength fading, held her baby one last time, whispering love into his tiny hands, telling him to eat well, to make friends, to never give up, to live as if every breath were a gift. When dawn came, the village was still standing, but its brightest flame had gone out. The stone faces on the mountain gained another shadow, and the world moved forward again, pretending not to notice the weight of another dream cut short. In the years that followed, Naruto grew up without knowing the sound of his parents' voices, his name known to everyone, yet his face avoided by most. The village that had been saved by his sacrifice now feared the creature sealed within him. Children whispered, parents looked away, and the boy who carried the will of fire's purest spark learned loneliness before he learned language. Yet even in that silence, Even as the world turned its back, something within him refused to break. The same flame that had burned in Hashirama's kindness, in Asura's compassion, in his mother's laughter, and his father's courage, flickered quietly in his heart, waiting. And so the story began again, as it always does, with a child who believed that love could change the world, even if the world did not believe in him yet. The will of fire had not died. It had simply taken on a new form, smaller, hungrier, stubborn, alive. It would grow, as all fires do, until the whole world could feel its warmth again. So breathe softly now, and let the image settle in your mind, the boy alone on the swing beneath the tree, the leaves falling like promises, the village beyond him, both home and exile. Every great story begins quietly, in moments the world overlooks, and in that quiet, the dream of peace waits once more to be found. The boy grew up in the same village his father had died protecting, beneath the faces of men carved into the mountain who had promised to protect children like him, and yet he had never felt less safe, never felt less seen. The air of Konoha was full of laughter, the smell of food from market stalls, the sound of sandals clattering against stone. But wherever Naruto went, the noise seemed to stop. Eyes turned, voices lowered, doors closed. He did not know why at first, only that every smile he offered was returned with silence. Every attempt at kindness met with fear. The fox sealed inside him, the same beast that had once torn through the village, was a shadow that followed him even when he didn't understand its shape. He learned to wear his loneliness like a cloak, to fill the quiet with noise of his own making. Mischief became his language, laughter his shield. If no one would see him for who he was, then at least they would have to notice him somehow. Underneath the mischief was a stubborn hope that no amount of rejection could erase. He trained, clumsily at first, his chakra leaking, his clones dissolving before they could even stand. But every failure was followed by another attempt. Every humiliation met with another grin. The other children whispered that he would never be a real shinobi, that he would never graduate the academy. He heard them all, and he smiled wider. Somewhere, deep down, he already understood what every great shinobi before him had learned the hard way, that strength is not born from talent, but from refusal to quit. When Iruka-sensei tied the leaf headband around Naruto's forehead for the first time, he didn't just give him a symbol of belonging, he gave him permission to dream. For the first time in his life, Naruto felt the weight of pride instead of isolation, the warmth of a single adult's faith cutting through years of silence. The will of fire, dimmed for so long in that small, neglected heart, flickered brighter. From that moment on, Naruto wasn't just a boy trying to be noticed. He was a shinobi with a promise that one day, everyone who had ignored him would have to acknowledge his name. "I'm going to be Hokage," he shouted, again and again, like a prayer to a sky that still hadn't learned to answer kindly. The team he was assigned to would shape the rest of his life. Kakashi Hatake, his teacher, stood at the front of their little squad like a monument to quiet sorrow, his single visible eye reflecting more loss than most men carry in a lifetime. Beside Naruto stood Sakura Haruno, whose intelligence and will were as fierce as her uncertainty, and Sasuke Uchiha, the last son of a clan erased by its own tragedy, a boy whose silence mirrored Naruto's in ways neither of them yet understood. Together they formed Team 7, 3 children bound by accident, destiny, and a sense of incompleteness that would one day tie them together and tear them apart. Their missions began small lost pets, simple escorts, the kind of work meant to teach patience rather than power. But even those simple days carried meaning. For every mission, no matter how trivial, was another chance for Naruto to prove that he belonged. The first time they fought for their lives, on the bridge in the land of waves, Naruto saw what being a shinobi really meant. Blood in the rain, fear that did not fade. A man who died smiling because his dream had been fulfilled. He learned that strength was not about power, but about protecting others even when it hurt. In the mirror of Haku's sacrifice, he saw the reflection of his own potential to care so deeply that even enemies could be forgiven. As the years passed, his bond with Sasuke deepened and darkened, growing from rivalry into something harder to name. They pushed each other beyond limits, each seeing in the other what he feared in himself: loneliness, ambition, the need to prove one's existence. Naruto envied Sasuke's talent. Sasuke envied Naruto's unbreakable heart. Beneath their fights and their laughter, a silent promise formed that no matter how far they strayed, they would not let go. It was a promise the world would test again and again. Exams came, enemies rose, and the village learned that the boy they had ignored carried not only the 9 tails, but an unshakable will. He fought not for revenge, but for recognition, not for glory, but for connection. And each time he fell, each time he failed, he stood again with the same smile that had once been a mask, but was now a weapon proof that the cycle of hatred could be broken, one act of stubborn kindness at a time. When Orochimaru's shadow fell over Konoha, when the invasion turned the village into another field of fire, Naruto's voice carried louder than fear. He fought not as the son of a hero, but as a boy who had chosen his own path, facing monsters born from the same pain that haunted him. He defeated them not by strength alone, but by believing, by reminding even his enemies that they were still human. The will of fire spread again, not as command, but as contagion, passed from one heart to another through the simple insistence that life was still worth defending. By the time the smoke cleared, the boy no one wanted had become the spark everyone depended on. The elders looked at him with new eyes. The villagers whispered his name not in fear but in awe. He still grinned the same, still shouted, still dreamed, but now the world had started to listen. Somewhere in the Hokage's office, Hiruzen smiled quietly, proud of a boy who reminded him of everything the village had forgotten. But even he knew that peace is only ever the space between storms, and that Naruto's path, like those before him, would carry him into greater darkness before it led him back into the light. So breathe softly now, and imagine that boy beneath the endless sky, his orange jacket bright against the falling leaves, his voice echoing down the streets that once ignored him, promising that one day no child would have to feel alone again. The wind that stirs those leaves is the same wind that carried the sage's first prayer, the same breath that moves through every era, whispering that hope, no matter how small, can outlast any curse. The seasons moved gently over the village, green giving way to gold and back again, and the boy who had once shouted his dream from empty streets began to grow into it, though the path he walked was long and tangled. The memory of the third Hokage faded into legend, another carved face upon the mountain, another spirit carried forward in the will of fire, and Konoha found itself once more at the edge of change. The Sannin returned from their wandering, summoned home by duty and loss, and Tsunade, the woman who had sworn never to heal again, was persuaded to take up the mantle of fifth Hokage, her heart still broken, yet still willing to protect. Under her watch, the village breathed again, mending the wounds left by Orochimaru's treachery, by war, by the quiet grief that never quite left its streets. Naruto trained harder than ever, driven by a promise made beneath the falling moonlight to bring Sasuke back, to save the friend who had turned away from the light. He sought wisdom from Jiraiya, his teacher and his father in all but name, and together they wandered beyond the village's borders into a wider world that was both beautiful and cruel. The older man taught him how to shape the roaring energy within him, how to balance fury and purpose, how to laugh even when the weight of prophecy pressed on his shoulders. Because by then, whispers had already begun to circle stories of a child of prophecy, a savior who would one day bring either salvation or destruction to the shinobi world. Jiraiya believed it was Naruto, and Naruto, too innocent to understand the burden, simply grinned and said he would find a way to make everyone happy. The world, tired of heroes, almost smiled with him, while he learned to mold his strength. The darkness he sought to cure deepened elsewhere. Sasuke, consumed by grief and pride, left the village to chase the ghost of power, believing that only through strength could he avenge his clan, could he silence the scream that never left his heart. Orochimaru welcomed him like a serpent offering shelter, whispering the same poison that had corrupted so many before. To him that love is weakness, that revenge is meaning. From that moment, the river of their destinies split wide, one flowing toward light, the other into shadow, though both still carried the same current, the desire to be free from pain. Naruto's return to Konoha marked the beginning of new trials, the kind that measured not muscle but spirit. He was older now, but still unrefined, his heart as wide as ever, his compassion both strength and vulnerability. The Akatsuki emerged from legend then, a gathering of those who had seen the world's hypocrisy and decided to end it by force. Each of them carried tragedy in their eyes. Each believed they were saving humanity from itself. They hunted the tailed beasts, calling them weapons, not understanding, or perhaps understanding too well, that these creatures were pieces of divinity, fragments of Kaguya's sorrow, scattered through time. One by one, they captured the beasts, each victory another loss for the balance of the world, each act of control another echo of the same mistake that had birthed all Chakra's suffering. Through all of it, Naruto's world kept expanding. He met people from distant lands, fought enemies who should have hated him, but instead learned from his stubborn kindness. He learned that power alone could not protect what he loved, that every victory came with a price, that even peace required pain. When Jiraiya left to face his final battle in the Rain Village, Naruto begged to follow, but his teacher only smiled that tired, gentle smile that carried both pride and farewell. The news of Jiraiya's death reached Konoha like thunder, and for the first time, Naruto felt the full depth of loss, not as a child abandoned, but as a man left behind. He cried until the sound broke him, and when it was over, he stood, quieter, heavier, yet more determined than ever. The boy who had once promised to be Hokage because he wanted attention now wanted it because he understood what it meant to bear the pain of everyone, to smile so others could rest. It was around then that he found Mount Myoboku, the realm of the toads and sages, where the air itself hummed with memory and the water shimmered with chakra older than words. There he learned to listen to the pulse beneath his skin, to the whisper of nature's own rhythm. He trained until his hands bled and his spirit burned, learning not to command chakra but to join it, to breathe with it as one breathes with the world. When he returned to Konoha, he was no longer just a boy chasing a dream. He was the living embodiment of that dream's endurance, and yet even that newfound strength was tested when pain came. The man who had once been a student of Jiraiya now turned God by grief and conviction. His 6 bodies descended upon the village with judgment in their eyes, speaking of peace through domination, of ending war by ending freedom itself. The destruction that followed was absolute, the village reduced to rubble, the mountain faces cracked, the air thick with dust and despair. Naruto returned to find his home gone, his people broken, his heart trembling not with anger but sorrow. Yet when he faced pain, he did not fight with hatred. He listened. He remembered what Jiraiya had taught him, what his parents had died believing, what every teacher had hoped he would understand, that peace begins not with power, but with empathy. When he spoke to Nagato, the true face behind pain, his voice carried generations of yearning. He forgave him. He believed in him, and in that belief, something ancient shifted, as if the curse that had begun with Indra and Asura finally paused to take a breath. The world, for a moment, was silent, not the silence of death, but of awe. The village was rebuilt, not just from stone, but from trust. Naruto's name spread beyond borders, no longer the fool, no longer the outcast, but the one who had shown that mercy is not weakness, that forgiveness can be the sharpest blade of all. And so the boy became the bridge between past and future, between gods and men, between despair and hope. His story was still unfinished, but the pattern was clear. The same cycle that had broken every generation before might finally find rest in him. The child of prophecy, the son of fire and wind, the boy who carried within him the echo of every love that had ever refused to die. So breathe deeply, listener of dreams, and picture the quiet that follows a storm, a rebuilt village, sunlight spilling over new roofs, laughter returning to streets once turned to ash. Somewhere within that light walks a boy with golden hair and a tired smile, waving to everyone as though he has known them forever. Because, in a way, he has. He is the memory of all who came before, the answer whispered through centuries of sorrow. Walking, the village rebuilt itself again, as it always did, the smell of sawdust and earth rising through the morning air, the laughter of children threading through the hum of work. Grass grew over the rubble, flowers pushed through the cracks, and the people of Konoha learned once more how to live between loss and gratitude. Naruto walked among them, not as a hero to be worshipped, but as a reminder of what could still be mended. He smiled at every child who stared at him wide-eyed, nodded to the old men rebuilding fences, helped carry timber for homes that weren't his. He belonged now, though belonging felt strange after so many years of loneliness. In his chest, the nine tails stirred quietly, its anger softened by the same persistence that had softened everyone else. They spoke sometimes, the boy and the beast, and their conversations became less about control and more about understanding. Two beings, once enemies, learning to breathe with the same rhythm. Peace returned to Konoha, but peace never stays still. The world beyond its walls began to move again, whispers turning into plans, plans turning into armies. The nations, weary from rebuilding, had forgotten the taste of fear, and so began to chase power once more. Somewhere far away, old names resurfaced, Akatsuki fragments gathering under new banners, the shadow of Madara Uchiha spoken aloud again, not as legend but as warning. It was a different kind of danger now, not born from hatred alone but from despair disguised as order, from men who believed that ending choice was the same as ending pain. Naruto trained still, not because he sought power but because he had learned that dreams require strength to survive. He traveled with Kakashi and Yamato, met Gaara again, no longer an enemy but a fellow bearer of loneliness transformed into purpose. They stood together beneath the desert sun, two Jinchuriki who had learned that the monsters inside them were not curses but mirrors, reflections of humanity's fear and its capacity for love. When Gaara became Kazekage, Naruto felt a pride that was half joy, half challenge, as if the world had proven that change was possible. Yet the threads of destiny continued to tighten. Sasuke, wandering through the shadows of vengeance, became the echo of every tragedy that had ever plagued the shinobi world. He sought answers in ruins, power in isolation, truth in the graves of those who had once called him brother. The death of Itachi, his brother, his enemy, his final teacher, left him hollow, and in that hollow space grew conviction that the world itself was cursed and must be rewritten. Where Naruto sought to connect, Sasuke sought to sever. The twin currents of Indra and Asura surged once more, invisible but relentless, drawing them toward each other as all opposites are drawn. When the Fourth Great Ninja War began, it did not arrive with trumpets or declarations, but with tremors beneath the soil, chakra gathering like thunderclouds. The allied shinobi forces, once enemies, joined hands for the first time in history, their banners fluttering side by side. Naruto stood among them, no longer the outcast child, but the heart of their unity, his voice carrying over the ranks with a calm he hadn't known he possessed. "We're all connected," he told them, and for once, everyone listened. The war that followed was vast and terrible, a storm of chakra and memory, gods and mortals colliding in the dust of their ancestors' mistakes. On the battlefield, Naruto met every face of the past. He fought alongside the spirits of those who had taught him, beside the reanimated Hokage, beside the friends who had once doubted him. The lines between living and dead blurred, as if the world itself had decided to gather all its threads in one final weave. He faced Obito Uchiha, the man behind the mask, the boy who had once shared his dream of becoming Hokage, and saw in him not a villain, but a reflection of what he might have become if loneliness had ever won. In their battle, forgiveness became sharper than any kunai. When Obito fell, the world trembled again, because one more piece of the curse had been released. And then came Madara, resurrected and brilliant and broken, the ghost of ambition so vast it bent reality around him. He fought not out of hatred but out of exhaustion, convinced that only illusion could save humanity from itself. Naruto stood against him, not as an equal in power alone, but as the final argument for freedom. When even that battle was eclipsed by Kaguya's return, when the mother of chakra herself broke through the veil of myth to reclaim what had once been hers, the cycle reached its oldest point. Gods and men, parent and child, love and fear, all of it met in the same place it had begun. In that impossible war, Naruto and Sasuke fought side by side again, their powers resonating like opposite notes in the same song. They sealed Kaguya not with hatred but with resolve, returning her to silence, giving the world another chance to learn. But when the dust settled, they looked at each other and knew it was not over, because the fight between them was never truly about good and evil. It was about how to love a world that kept breaking. They met one last time at the Valley of the End, where their ancestors had once stood, where statues watched and rivers remembered. The battle left them both shattered, their arms gone, their bodies broken, their hearts at last exposed. And in the stillness that followed, they reached toward each other, not in victory, not in defeat, but in understanding. The cycle, at last, stopped turning. When they woke, the sun was rising. The river glowed gold. The wind carried the scent of rain. And for the first time since the sages' sons had quarreled, there was silence unburdened by conflict. Sasuke smiled a small, tired, human smile and acknowledged what Naruto had known all along, that love, though it fails, though it wounds, though it costs everything, is still the only path worth walking. They returned to Konoha together, not as enemies, but as remnants of a world learning to forgive itself. The war ended. The nations rebuilt again, this time slower, wiser. Naruto stood before the village and looked at the mountain where his father's face watched eternally, and in that moment he understood that every pain, every failure, every lonely night had been part of the same story. The child who had once been shunned now carried the world's hopes in his open hands, not as a hero, but as proof that hope can survive anything. And somewhere high above, where the wind meets the edge of the clouds, the spirits of the sage, of Indra and Asura, of all who had sought peace, finally rested. The wheel of hatred, for the first time, was still. Sleep softly now, listener, and let that stillness wash over you, the world at peace, the leaves whispering above quiet streets, the laughter of children echoing through a village that has at last remembered how to love. The years after the war passed like the long sigh that follows weeping, the world too tired to do anything but rest. Villages that had been reduced to ash found their shapes again, their walls raised not by fear but by cooperation, and for the first time in centuries, the nations looked at one another without reaching for weapons. Konoha, the heart that had once burned and broken and rebuilt itself more times than history could count, became a symbol of what survival could mean when it was guided not by conquest, but by compassion. The wind through its streets carried no smell of smoke now, only food and laughter, the kind of sounds that people forget are sacred until they return. The faces on the mountain stood untouched by time, silent watchers of a peace they had all died dreaming of, and beneath them, life unfolded quietly, beautifully, like a field left to grow wild. Naruto walked among that peace as if he could hardly believe it was real. He had fought through so much fire that calm felt almost like guilt. But little by little he learned how to live without always bracing for the next battle. He helped rebuild houses, carried supplies, played with children who shouted his name not in awe but in affection. When he stopped to rest, old friends found him, Shikamaru with his lazy wisdom, Ino and Choji, laughing at jokes from another lifetime, Sakura, with the gentleness she had learned through pain, and Kakashi, whose single visible eye had at last softened with contentment. Together they spoke not of missions but of memories, of what it meant to grow older and still be here. The scars that covered their bodies no longer marked shame or glory. They were just proof that they had lived. Sasuke left again, but not in anger. He walked beyond the borders of the village with a quiet smile, promising to wander, to understand the world he had once tried to destroy. Naruto didn't stop him. Their bond no longer required proximity. It was the kind of understanding that could stretch across continents. Letters came sometimes, brief and cryptic, folded into the hands of hawks that perched on Naruto's window at dawn. They were enough. The cycle of pursuit had ended. In its place was trust, simple and silent. The world's nations began to speak to one another differently. Where once their words had been edged with suspicion, now they carried the tone of shared weariness. The Kage met often, their councils filled with talk of trade, of rebuilding, of teaching children not to fear those beyond their borders. It was Gaara who said it first, that the world had been born again from the ashes of their foolishness, and the others, for once, agreed. They swore that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated, though everyone knew that promises are as fragile as glass. Still, it was something. Sometimes something is enough. In Konoha, time began to move like a river slowed by peace. Weddings followed one another, Shikamaru and Temari laughing beneath paper lanterns, Sai learning to smile for real beside Ino, and one day, Naruto standing nervously before Hinata, her eyes steady, her smile as soft as the morning Sunday. Their love had grown quietly, like ivy, persistent and sure. When they married, the village bells rang with a joy that felt like healing, and the laughter that filled the air was the sound of generations letting go of their sorrow. In their home, they spoke often of the world, as if it were a friend they had both promised to protect, and when their children were born, they carried that promise forward in their names and in the light of their eyes. Boruto came first, loud and restless, a mirror of his father's stubbornness and his mother's heart. Then Himawari, gentle as spring rain, whose laughter reminded Naruto of everything worth saving. The sight of them made him feel something he had never known, as a child's security that did not need to be proven. Every time he held them, he thought of his own parents, of the night they had given everything for him, and he whispered silent thanks into the air, hoping the wind would carry it wherever they were. Kakashi, weary from years of leadership, passed the Hokage's hat to Naruto, and the boy who had once been laughed at for dreaming too big became the man who embodied that dream. When he stood before the village for the first time as the seventh Hokage, the crowd's cheer rolled like thunder through the valley, and in every voice he heard forgiveness for himself, for the world, for all that had come before. He bowed his head, not in pride but in humility, because he knew that being Hokage did not mean standing above others. It meant standing between them and despair. Days turned to months, months to years. The new generation grew up without the smell of blood in their training grounds. They laughed, they argued, they chased each other through the same streets where their parents had once wept. And though the world beyond the village still held its dangers, within Konoha there was light enough to believe that the darkness could be kept at bay. Naruto worked long hours, his desk piled with reports and scrolls, but when he came home at night and saw the small shoes by the door, the soft glow of the lanterns, he felt peace. Not the peace of victory, but the quiet, ordinary peace of living, of breathing without fear. And yet, sometimes, when he stood atop the Hokage's tower at dusk, watching the sun sink behind the trees, he felt the faint pulse of something older. The same chakra that had once shaken mountains now stirred softly in the distance, reminding him that nothing truly ends. He smiled at the thought, not in worry but in understanding. The world does not need endings, it needs continuance. As long as there are people who remember, who forgive, who reach out even after being hurt, the fire will not die. The faces on the mountain glowed orange in the setting sun. Hashirama, Tobirama, Hiruzen, Minato, Tsunade, Kakashi, and now his own, carved at last into the stone above the village he had once called home and exile both. The wind moved through the leaves, carrying voices old and new, and for a moment he could almost hear them all, his parents, his teacher, his friends, his enemies, all whispering the same thing, that the story had been worth it. So breathe with the world now, quietly, as night begins to fall again over Konoha. The lights flicker in windows, the trees sway in rhythm with the stars, and the fire that began long before any of them still burns, steady and patient, waiting for another dawn. This is the peace they all dreamed of, not perfect, not eternal, but alive. The children born after the war grew up beneath a quieter sky, one that had forgotten how to thunder, one that seemed to hum softly with gratitude. They learned of the great battles only through stories told around dinner tables or in classrooms where the old teachers' voices trembled slightly when they spoke of names that no longer walked the earth. For them, pain was history, not memory. Boruto Uzumaki lived in that new world of peace, surrounded by friends, by laughter, by warmth, and yet he found it difficult to understand the weight of the legacy he carried. His father's face, carved into the mountain, looked down on the village every day, but to Boruto it was not a symbol of legend. It was just a reminder that his father was always too busy to come home for dinner. Naruto, who had once dreamed of acknowledgement, had become so important that the world itself seemed to claim him, and Boruto, restless and proud, could not see the love beneath that responsibility. He loved his father, but he also wanted to be free of the shadow that stretched across the whole village. He rebelled in small ways, the way all children of peace do late arrivals, half-finished homework, mischief that felt harmless until it hurt someone's feelings. Yet even his defiance was born from love, from wanting to be seen not as an extension of the man who saved the world, but as himself. Hinata watched them both, her patience deep as ever, her smile soft even when her heart ached. She understood both of them, the father who bore too much, the son who felt invisible beneath the weight of inherited dreams. The new generation mirrored the old, as children often do. Sarada Uchiha, daughter of Sasuke and Sakura, carried her father's eyes and her mother's courage, though she was still learning what it meant to hold them both at once. Mitsuki, the quiet boy with the strange calm of someone born from mystery, followed Boruto with a devotion that seemed almost older than friendship, as though he already knew what destiny would demand of them. Together they trained under Konohamaru, the boy who had once idolized Naruto, now a man trying to teach these restless hearts that peace requires effort too, that kindness, not combat, is the true skill of a shinobi. The missions they took were small at first, routine and safe, but even the smallest ripples eventually reached the edges of the pond. Beyond the borders of the known world, new technologies were changing everything. Machines that could mimic jutsu, weapons that made chakra feel unnecessary, cities that glittered with lights brighter than stars. Progress, people called it, though not everyone agreed on what was being gained or lost. The balance that had held the shinobi world together began to tilt again, this time not because of war, but because of forgetting. Peace breeds complacency, and complacency invites chaos disguised as innovation. In the shadows of that new dawn, strange movements stirred, new enemies born not from hatred but from emptiness, the desire to find meaning in a world that had outgrown its myths. Naruto watched it all with quiet understanding. He knew that every generation must find its own truth, that his children's struggles could not be solved by the same fire that had saved his own. He listened to their complaints, their frustrations, their dreams, and though exhaustion often bent his shoulders, he smiled anyway. He had learned from every teacher before him that love means enduring misunderstanding, that patience is a form of strength. When Boruto shouted that he didn't want to be like him, Naruto just nodded, knowing that someday the boy would understand that rebellion is only another way of saying, "I want to matter." Sasuke returned sometimes, his cloak torn by travel, his expression unchanged but his words gentler. He trained Boruto, seeing in him both his rival's spirit and his own younger self, reckless and searching. Under his guidance, Boruto learned not only how to fight, but how to see the weight of choices, the cost of power, the loneliness that hides behind glory. It was through Sasuke that Boruto began to realize that being strong was not about surpassing his father, but about protecting those he loved in his own way. Slowly, the anger that had filled him turned into purpose. The peace of the shinobi world began to strain as new threats emerged from beyond even Sasuke's long journeys. Ancient echoes of the Otsutsuki clan, the same lineage that had birthed Kaguya herself, returning in strange and terrifying forms. Their arrival reminded the world that chakra's origin was not myth but truth, and that the past, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to rise again. Naruto and Sasuke fought side by side once more, their bond now quiet but unbreakable, two fathers protecting not only their children, but the fragile hope those children represented. The battles were fierce, the stakes cosmic, yet at their heart they were the same as ever, about love, about fear, about the endless human need to prove that compassion can outlast destruction. When the dust settled, the world remained changed, scarred, alive. Boruto stood beside his father, no longer just a boy trying to escape a shadow, but a young shinobi beginning to cast one of his own. He understood now what Naruto had always known, that peace is not the absence of pain, but the courage to keep walking despite it. The legacy of chakra, the burden of prophecy, the weight of history, all of it had led to this simple truth, that connection, fragile and flawed, is the only thing strong enough to hold the world together. Naruto, older now, watched his son and felt the same awe he once felt, looking up at the faces on the mountain. He realized that one day those faces would change again, and that this was how the world healed, not through perfection, but through continuity. The will of fire was no longer just his to carry. It belonged to every child who dared to believe in a tomorrow they could shape with their own hands. And so the leaves rustled again, soft as breath, ancient as memory, whispering through the twilight streets of Konoha. Parents called their children home, lanterns flickered to life, and the mountain stood silent and proud above it all. The night held no fear now, only dreams, some of peace, some of challenge, all of them alive. The story, like the wind, went on. The age that followed was strange, shimmering at the edges like heat rising from stone, neither peace nor war, but a kind of restless calm. The villages prospered, trade routes bloomed, technology outpaced tradition, and everywhere screens and machines began to hum beside scrolls and chakra. Children grew up believing that danger was something from textbooks, that heroism was history. The great nations that had once bled for land now measured power in data and diplomacy, and though no one said it aloud, there was an unease that never quite left the air. When progress moves too quickly, the heart forgets to follow. The shinobi, born for struggle, found themselves uncertain of purpose in a world that no longer seemed to need them. And yet, the whisper of the past still lingered in every breath of wind, reminding them that peace, like all things, is fragile. Boruto felt it most keenly. He walked the same streets his father had once run through, shouting promises to the sky. But where Naruto had seen wonder, Boruto saw repetition. The monuments, the ceremonies, the ideals, all of it felt heavy, too ancient for a world that wanted to move faster. His friends spoke of ambition, of futures beyond the old hierarchies of shinobi life, but he couldn't let go of the feeling that something essential was slipping away. The academy taught them both ninjutsu and science now. Drones hovering beside teachers who quoted ancient scrolls, and somewhere between those two extremes, meaning got lost. Boruto's talent was undeniable, his movements effortless. Yet, behind every victory there was discontent, a quiet yearning for something unnamed. He loved his village, but he did not yet love what it asked him to be. Sarada, more deliberate, saw the same cracks but faced them with resolve rather than rebellion. She wanted to be Hokage, not because of legacy, but because she believed that the title could still mean something if carried with integrity. Her ambition steadied Boruto in ways he did not admit aloud. Mitsuki watched them both, his curiosity unclouded by pride, his heart an instrument tuned to empathy. Together, they represented three possible futures: the reformer, the dreamer, and the observer. The world, though it didn't know it yet, was already shifting to meet them. In the distance, storms began to gather again, not the wars of armies, but the subtler, more dangerous storms born from complacency. Strange marks appeared on Boruto's skin after his encounters with remnants of the Otsutsuki, symbols that pulsed like memories too ancient for his own body to understand. The same power that had once shattered gods now whispered through his veins, and though it frightened him, it also felt familiar, like a song half remembered. Naruto watched his son struggle with that inheritance, torn between protecting him and trusting him. He knew too well that the line between gift and curse is drawn not by destiny but by choice. Sasuke, returning from the outer edges of the world, became Boruto's guide again, teaching him that power does not corrupt, it only reveals. The new era forced everyone to redefine what being a shinobi meant. Missions became negotiations, jutsu became relics of an older art, and peace began to feel like stagnation. The younger generation wanted purpose, not maintenance. Some sought it through innovation, blending chakra with technology, inventing tools that could amplify their abilities. Others sought it in the old ways, retreating into training and tradition, believing that modernization dulled the spirit. Boruto stood between both sides, understanding that progress and heritage were not enemies, but he could not convince others so easily. In him the old world and the new world wrestled, the echo of the sage's first lesson repeating itself through yet another soul. Unity is not sameness, and evolution requires remembrance. The threats that came were different this time, quiet, insidious, wrapped in philosophy instead of fire. Groups arose, claiming that chakra itself was the root of human suffering, that to transcend the limitations of flesh was to end conflict entirely. Their technology could mimic ninjutsu, could shape matter without will, could rewrite memory. The shinobi system, built upon discipline and heart, began to tremble under the pressure of invention. Naruto and the other Kage convened often, their meetings filled with unease. They knew they were witnessing the birth of a new kind of war, one fought not with weapons but with meaning, a struggle over what it truly meant to be human in a world that had forgotten its divine roots. Through it all, Boruto kept searching. He trained under the sun and under the stars, learning to listen to the quiet inside him the way his father once had. The mark on his hand, his connection to something far older, became both burden and teacher. It showed him visions of a time before chakra was named, before the divisions of clans and nations, before even the sage had dreamed, and of peace. He saw the pattern clearly then. Every age believes itself new. Every generation repeats the same yearning in different language. But he also saw that each attempt brings the world a little closer to understanding itself. History does not circle. It spirals. It climbs. When he returned to the village after another long journey, he found Naruto waiting for him on the Hokage's tower. The older man's face was lined, his eyes still bright. They stood in silence for a while, watching the sunset. Boruto apologized for the years of distance, for the words thrown in anger, and Naruto only laughed softly, saying that fathers are just sons who have lived a little longer, and that understanding always comes late, but never too late. They stood there as the sky deepened into violet, two silhouettes against the wind, one carrying the fire of youth, the other the warmth of endurance, both part of the same flame. That night the lanterns in Konoha burned a little brighter. The streets buzzed with life, and the world turned again, slowly, beautifully, toward another dawn. The peace they had built was imperfect, always at risk, always worth protecting. The will of fire, born in a different age, still lived not as doctrine but as instinct, the quiet decision made in every generation to keep loving the world even when it hurts. And so the story of the shinobi continued, not with endings, but with beginnings that looked like memories, each one a breath in the long, unbroken rhythm of humanity's dream to understand itself. The wind whispered through the leaves, carrying names that will never fade, and beneath that sound, the village slept safe for now, alive for always. The world had grown quieter again, the kind of quiet that does not mean emptiness but fullness, the hum of a world finally breathing evenly, the long exhale after centuries of tension. The leaves of Konoha's trees shimmered in the morning wind, the same leaves that had once watched over bloodshed, now whispering softly of renewal. In that calm, the shinobi world began to understand something it had always been running from: that peace is not a prize won by war, but a rhythm learned only through patience, through remembering. The monuments stood unchanged, but the people beneath them were different, their movements slower, their laughter gentler. Generations who had never seen battle filled the streets, their only war the small struggles of growing, of learning, of loving. And above them all, Naruto, older now, stood at his window and smiled, seeing in every face below the living proof of his parents' sacrifice, his teacher's hope, his friend's faith. The will of fire no longer burned with urgency, it glowed with warmth. He thought often of those who had gone before Jiraiya, who had taught him that strength without kindness was just another form of cruelty. Neji, who had died proving that destiny can be rewritten. Nagato, whose pain had given him understanding. Sasuke, whose shadow had shaped his light, and his father, whose legacy he had finally come to forgive as much as he had fulfilled. Their lessons lived in every decision he made, and in the faces of every student who now studied under the banner of peace. The academy had changed. Its classrooms were filled not with drills for war, but with the philosophy of coexistence, the understanding that chakra connects, that to hurt another is to wound oneself. It was a lesson the world had taken 1,000 years to learn, and even now it trembled at the edges, fragile but real. Sometimes, when the paperwork grew too heavy and the meetings too long, Naruto would walk outside the village alone, past the training fields and into the forest beyond, the same forest where he had once thrown kunai at trees, pretending they were enemies, the same path where he had once chased dreams too big for the world to hold. The forest was older now, its roots deep, its silence kind. He would stand there and feel the chakra that lived in everything, the soft pulse of the world that had once seemed so chaotic now moving in harmony. In that rhythm he could almost hear the voice of the sage of 6 paths, echoing across centuries. All things are connected. Separation is an illusion. It was the same truth that had begun with Kaguya's sorrow, that had rippled through her sons, through the endless battles of their descendants, through every mistake, every act of forgiveness, every choice to keep believing in love despite the pain it caused. Back in the village, Boruto and his friends grew into their own roles, their missions taking them farther from home, but always leading them back again. They spoke of modernization and balance, of finding harmony between technology and tradition, between individual freedom and shared responsibility. The old ninja ways were not lost, only transformed symbols carried forward, not in secrecy but in understanding. The hidden villages were hidden no longer. They were open to one another, their borders blurred by trust. Children from every nation attended Konoha's academy, learning not how to fight, but how to listen. The idea that had begun as a whisper in the heart of a lonely boy had become the foundation of a world at last learning to forgive itself. In the evenings, Naruto would return home to find Hinata waiting, her hair silvered with time but her eyes as soft as ever. They would sit together on the porch, watching fireflies rise above the fields, their hands brushing lightly, their silence companionable. Boruto would visit when his travels allowed, his smile still full of youth, his stories filled with distant lands and new philosophies, and Naruto would listen, seeing in him the same light that had guided him once. Sometimes Sarada came too, speaking of the reforms she wanted to make when her time came, and he would nod, knowing that she would surpass him, that this was how it was meant to be. The will of fire was not a torch passed from one hand to another. It was a flame that grew brighter with every life it touched. The world beyond Konoha continued to change. Machines hummed where once chakra sang, and the sky glowed at night with the light of inventions no one had imagined before. Some said the age of shinobi was ending, but Naruto knew better. The world would always need those who could see connections where others saw divisions, who could remember that strength without love is hollow. The form might change the weapons, the language, the tools, but the essence was eternal. Protect what matters, love even when it hurts, and never let despair define you. That, more than any jutsu, was the true art of the ninja. Sometimes, at dawn, when the mist still clung to the rooftops, he would visit the memorial stone. He would trace the names carved there and speak softly, telling them of the world they had helped build, of the laughter that now filled the air, of the children who no longer cried out of fear but out of joy. He would close his eyes and feel them listening, their presence as real as the wind against his face. In those moments he felt the entirety of history behind him, the sage Kaguya, the wars, the pain, the endless striving, and he would whisper, "We did it, in our way." And somewhere, far beyond time, perhaps they smiled. As night settled, the village lights flickered like stars fallen to earth. The world was not perfect, but it was alive, and that was enough. The trees rustled, the leaves turned their silver sides to the moon, and the whisper that had begun with the first pulse of chakra echoed once more. Love endures, connection redeems, and even the smallest spark can keep the darkness at bay. Sleep softly now, listener, for this is the story of how the world healed itself, how the curse became a blessing, how every tear shed by the shinobi was gathered into an ocean of forgiveness. The will of fire still burns, gentle and patient, in every heart that chooses to care. It has no beginning and no end, only the quiet, eternal promise that tomorrow will come. The night in Konoha stretched soft and long, a sky of deep indigo folded around the village, like a blanket drawn lovingly across the shoulders of a child after a long day. The lamps burned low in the streets, their golden light trembling against the wind, and the hum of the world slowed to a rhythm that was neither waking nor sleeping, a steady pulse like the quiet heart of time itself. The faces on the mountain watched as they always had, carved by hands long gone but never forgotten. Their expressions softened by moonlight until they seemed less like stone and more like memory. Beneath them, generations slept, children who dreamed of the sea they had never seen, parents who whispered prayers of gratitude, elders who smiled in their sleep because they had lived long enough to see peace grow roots. The world had changed, but in the stillness it was possible to feel the thread that connected everything, from the first flicker of chakra to the laughter echoing faintly through the streets. Naruto stood at the edge of the Hokage's tower, his cloak brushing against the wind, his eyes tracing the lights below. The years had carved lines into his face, not harshly but gently, the way rivers carve stone, until they look like they were always meant to flow that way. His hair caught the moonlight, gold turned to silver, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to do nothing but breathe. The air smelled of pine and smoke and rain that had not yet fallen. He thought of his father, who had once stood in this same place, holding the world's weight in trembling hands, and he smiled because now that weight was not so heavy. It had been shared, passed down, transformed. The dream of one man had become the dream of everyone. He looked toward the forests beyond the village, where the wind whispered secrets older than any human name, and in that whisper he heard the voices of all who had come before. The sage of 6 paths, patient and weary, murmuring of balance. Kaguya, sorrowful and alone, reminding him that even love can destroy if it forgets itself. Hashirama's laughter, Tobirama's stern pride, Hiruzen's gentle wisdom, Jiraiya's booming voice filled with impossible hope, all of them alive within the wind that moved through the leaves. They had never left. They had only changed form. They were the roots, and he was the flower, and after him there would be fruit and seed and forest again, because that is what life does. It continues, endlessly reshaping itself until the pain becomes beauty. He thought of his son, out there somewhere beyond the horizon, chasing his own truth. Boruto's path would not be his, and that was right. Every generation must build its own dream. The parent's task is only to make sure the soil is soft enough for new roots to grow. He trusted him completely. The fire that once burned wildly in his own heart now flickered quietly in Boruto's, different, but just as alive. The world belonged to them now, to those who would take everything old and make it new without breaking it. Progress and tradition, love and duty, memory and motion, all part of the same current. The wind shifted, carrying laughter from the training grounds far below. The night watch had gathered there, young shinobi who had never seen war yet trained with the same seriousness as their ancestors. He could hear their voices, Shikadai's easy humor, Sarada's command, Metal's nervous laughter, Himawari's quiet confidence, and the sound filled him with peace, so deep it was almost unbearable. It was the sound of everything he had ever fought for, the right of children to be unafraid, the right of the world to rest. He closed his eyes and remembered what Jiraiya had written all those years ago, that the true measure of a shinobi is not how he lives, but how he dies protecting the dreams of those who come after. But perhaps, Naruto thought, the world had finally grown enough that dying was no longer required to protect it. Perhaps the greatest act of love now was simply to live fully, to keep waking up, to keep tending the fire that burned quietly in every home. The will of fire was no longer a torch passed from hand to hand on battlefields. It was a constellation of small lights, each one carried by someone who refused to give up on kindness. Somewhere in the mountains, the first snow of the season began to fall, drifting down in slow, deliberate spirals, landing on the roofs and the fields, turning the village silver. The moonlight caught on it, scattering across the sky until it seemed as though the stars themselves had descended to rest among the trees. Naruto watched, awed as he had been the first time he ever saw the sun rise after a night of sorrow, and he whispered softly, not to anyone, but to everything, "Thank you." It was not prayer or command, but gratitude and acknowledgement of all the moments, the people, the choices that had led here. In that whisper lay every lesson of the shinobi world. That strength comes from connection. That forgiveness is the only real victory. That love, though fragile, is indestructible when shared. The chakra that once tore continents apart now hummed quietly in the roots of trees, in the flow of rivers, in the breath of sleeping children. The cycle had not been broken, it had been completed, harmonized, turned into song. And that song, the melody of countless souls learning slowly, painfully, beautifully to understand one another, filled the night. The stars shifted. Dawn waited just below the horizon, a faint glow spreading like hope across the sky. Naruto turned from the edge of the tower and descended the stairs, his steps slow, unhurried. He would wake the village soon, start another day of meetings and letters and laughter, another ordinary morning in an extraordinary peace. But for now, he let himself linger in the quiet. The world did not need heroes anymore. It needed caretakers, listeners, dreamers, and he was content to be one of them. The first light of day touched the village, brushing the faces on the mountain with gold. Minato's smile gleamed, Hiruzen's eyes softened, Tsunade's determination shone bright, and beside them, Naruto's own stone face caught the sun, its carved grin alive in the new morning. The leaves trembled, the wind stirred, and for a heartbeat the entire world seemed to breathe as one. The story of Naruto Uzumaki, of the shinobi, of humanity itself, was not a tale of battles won or legends carved. It was the long, slow, luminous story of hearts refusing to stop reaching for one another, even in the dark. So rest now, dreamer of faraway worlds and endless seas of leaves. Let the wind of Konoha carry you into sleep. Let the soft rustle of branches remind you that every struggle finds its peace, every flame finds its warmth, every lonely soul finds its echo. The fire still burns, gentle, eternal, waiting for the next morning, the next dream, the next name whispered into the world. Good night, shinobi. Good night, village of hidden leaves. The story continues in every heartbeat.